It can be said that the Dornier Do.335 Pfeil is a halting brute of an aircraft, and quite possibly one of the more remarkable machines to have emerged from Germany during the war, and that's quite a feat considering the competition for the strangest and most unusual aircraft was quite stiff. Not only did it have an unusual engine layout, but the Do.335 was potentially one of the fastest piston-engine fighters and bomber destroyers ever built. Well, in the top 5 at least. Up there with the North American P-51H Mustang and the Supermarine Spiteful F-16. The night fighter versions would have been able to hunt down the de Havilland Mosquito under cover of darkness, and had it been fitted with the upward slanting Schrage Musik cannons, RAF Bomber Command's Lancasters would have been sitting ducks. And despite its imposing size, the Pfeil would have been a formidable fighter, which in simulated dogfights was able to outmaneuver even the FW-190. Many have speculated that had the Pfeil arrived earlier and had been put into meaningful production, it would have provided the Luftwaffe with a highly effective heavy night and day fighter. But vacillations on the part of the Reich Air Ministry was to delay its introduction into service. Unfortunately for us aviation nuts, not so much for the bomber crews, it was never tested in combat, at least none that can be 100% verified. The claims that the 335 would have been one of the more outstanding aircraft of the Second World War is a complex claim to back up. This is an aircraft I've been wanting to cover for a very long time, since I believe she was the Wunderwaffe, which the history of the war pivoted. If she had been produced earlier and in substantial numbers, the outcome of various air battles and bombing campaigns over Europe would have had vastly different outcomes. In this video, we cover the origins and inspiration for the 335, the prototype versions, the pre-production models, the politics, and how the Pfeil would have stacked up against the best that the Allies had to offer. So grab a cup of tea, a packet of Waffeletten, and auf geht's! Despite its novel appearance, the Dornier Do.335 with its centerline thrust layout was a radical rather than revolutionary aircraft. In fact, this design concept wasn't new in aviation. What made the 335 unique is that it took many different ideas and merged them into a single machine. The principle of aligning engines fore and aft for streamlined thrust was experimented with early aircraft in the First World War, with the ill-fated Fokker K-1 and the very sticky-looking Siemens Schuckert DDR-1 triplane. These were twin-boom designs of sorts, with the engines mounted fore and aft of a pilot seated in a central nacelle. During the interwar period, the concept evolved with aircraft like the prototype twin-boomed Tupolev I-12 or Ant-23, designed by Andrei Tupolev's team, that never made it into production due to poor performance and concerns that any pilot attempting to bail out would be fed through the rear prop. In 1939, there was a Dutch Fokker D-23 with a similar configuration that was binned due to engine cooling issues, something that would rear its head in the future 335. Messrs. Vanisse and Gaultier, working at the Arsenal de l'Aéronautique, displayed rather more ingenuity in achieving the same end with the short-lived wooden Arsenal VG-20, later VB-10, that moved away from the twin-boom structure and incorporated contra-rotating propellers, powered by concentric shafts. This approach allowed compactness and overcame challenges like torque compensation while improving thrust efficiency. During this time, Professor Dr. Claude Dornier, who with men like Junkers, Messerschmitt and Heinkel was to have a lasting influence on German aviation, had from the start been in the thick of it, when in 1916 he had taken 4 240 horsepower Maybach engines, paired them up and placed them into his second giant flying boat, the Zeppelin Lindau RS-2B. The first aircraft developed by Dornier with engines in this distinctive tandem arrangement. This flying boat, equipped with 4 engines and placed in a push-and-pull arrangement, provided the first spark for dozens of designs that followed, such as the RS-3 and RS-4. Between 1918 until the late 1930s, Dornier was responsible for producing some of the most beautiful aircraft of the era, starting in 1922 with the famous and successful Wal, or whale, flying boats, which had a tandem engine layout and a central nacelle above the wing, with one engine driving a tractor propeller and the other driving a pusher. Over the next 2 decades, Dornier would go on to produce a series of flying boats and land-based aircraft, all with the same tandem engine principle, from the Do.N, a land version of the Val, and the DOK2, a 4-engined aircraft with the engines mounted in a push and pull configuration on the struts below the wing. In 1929, Dornier revealed the Do.X, with 3 decks and a wingspan of 137 feet, powered by 12 huge Siemens-built Bristol Jupiter radial engines in tandem push-pull configuration mountings. This aircraft would be the largest, heaviest, most powerful flying boat ever built at the time. In my humble opinion, these Art Deco lines make her one of the most visually stunning machines. Carrying up to 100 passengers, this flying ship was the absolute ultimate in German aircraft construction of the day. Although Claude Dornier had been interested in the advantages of the centerline thrust concept from an early phase in his career, it was not until 1936 when the Do.18 flying boat appeared, when for the first time, the rear motor of the tandem pair drove the propeller via an extension of the crankshaft. This concept gave Dornier the idea that the layout could be developed to position the cockpit and pilot between the 2 motors, with the rear engine driving an air screw aft of a cruciform tail. It was the combination of all 3 ideas, the tandem engine, the extended drive shaft, and the propeller aft of the tailplane, that made the Do.335 unique amongst combat aircraft. Although the unusual placement of the rear air screw was not entirely novel, since the Taten-Paulhan Aerotorpille of 1911 had a similar configuration, the same goes for the Italian JONA J10, first proposed in 1935. It must be said that the Do.335, no aircraft had paired a rear-mounted propeller with a conventional tractor air screw at the nose and successfully flown. A quick note. Yes, I am aware that the Japanese also attempted to design their push-pull aircraft into the Tachikawa Ki 94-1, but this never progressed beyond the drawing board. The centerline thrust kept rearing its head simply because of the enormous benefits it was known to bring. First of all, 2 engines are generally better than 1. If one gives up the ghost, there's always the second one to take you home. The second advantage of the layout is that the asymmetrical thrust issues in the event of engine failure are eliminated. The third upside is that this configuration solved the fighter designer's constant demand for more power than can ever be afforded by contemporary engines, and overcame the penalties exacted in the form of increased drag and reduced maneuverability by adopting 2 engines in an orthodox wing-mounted arrangement. With the tandem layout, the aircraft would have 2 engines, but a more streamlined frontal area of 1 engine and an uncluttered wing. On the 3rd of August 1937, Dornier filed the configuration under the patent number 728044. For such an aircraft, the advantages of the layout were, to quote the patent, an aircraft consisting of at least 3 separately built and interchangeable parts, a front section containing a propulsion unit with a tractor propeller, a center section protected by firewalls fore and aft containing the crew, instrumentation and possibly also the fuel, and a rear section carrying the tail unit and second engine with a pusher propeller. An aircraft, as above, with the center section provided with an outer skin having increased resistance to bullets in the usual manner, for instance by several millimeters thick steel plating. Dornier began working on a project incorporating the proposed features shortly after filing the patent. Designated Projekt P59, it was intended to develop 4 design variants. 2 were intended for possible production, and the other 2 as record-breaking aircraft equipped with finely tuned engines. The first variant, P5901, meant for production, was planned to have 2 DB601 engines with an output of 1,150 horsepower and a proposed maximum speed of 444 miles an hour at 13,000 feet. The next 2 variants were designed to be record breakers. For instance, the P5902 model with DB601 engines, each with an output of 1,760 horsepower and an expected maximum speed of 484 miles an hour at sea level, whereas the P5903 record variant also with a pair of DB601 engines, but this time each delivering a massive 2,000 horsepower that was expected to have pushed her past 505 miles an hour at sea level. The final variant, P5904, also meant for production, again with DB601 engines with a tempered power output of 1,250 horsepower, but with an estimated top speed of 470 miles an hour at 15,000 feet. With the knowledge gained from these studies, Dornier began even more detailed project work and simultaneously tried to arouse interest in the aircraft among the relevant authorities. In November 1939, the aircraft project was completed and summarized in the P5905 project. With these plans in hand, he approached the technical office of the Reich Ministry of Aviation, or RLM, which thoroughly analyzed the designs. Nevertheless, the first three variants were rejected, although the aircraft was seriously considered and almost greenlit for production as a fast bomber. Still, the RLM had reservations about the extended rear driveshaft, believing that such a long appendage would suffer from vibrations. Also, unfortunately for Dornier, the military situation in 1940 looked good for the Germans. It was a time of continuous victories, and therefore not favorable to avant-garde war-winning technical superweapons. No one in the German High Command even dreamed it would all be over in a few years. At the time, it seemed the Third Reich would indeed last 1,000 years. The Allies were far from occupying Berlin, and there was no indication that it would ever happen. In such a situation, the RLM decided it was unnecessary to focus on developing such revolutionary designs if the Bf-109, Ju-88, Ju-87, and He-111 types would be sufficient for victory in the air war. Hermann Göring, responsible for the 4-year plan, wanted to prioritize specific projects with a target completion date of 1940 or early 1941. He emphasized that resources, particularly economic ones, should be allocated preferentially to these immediate objectives. Any other programs that would take longer to materialize were to be delayed or deprioritized if they required significant financial investment to ensure the success of the more urgent plans. Göring wrote to Air Minister Funk in February 1940, saying, "By all means, the plans must be furthered that will come into being in 1940 or by the spring of 1941. All other programs, which would come to fruition later, must, if they require economic outlays, be postponed in favor of the aforementioned plans." For now, the P5904 was dead in the water. Even so, Dornier was convinced his tandem-engined idea had merit. Yet he was also fully aware that there may be drawbacks to having a rear engine with a long shaft driving a pusher propeller. Therefore, to prove the layout, he commissioned Dr. Ulrich Hutter, an aeronautical engineer, to design a small flying testbed with Schempp-Hirth at Wusterberg, known for producing gliders up to that time, to construct it. The result was a very light aircraft named the Göppingen GO9, which was a scaled-down DO-17. This little machine had a span of 23 feet 71 inches, a length of 22 feet 31 inches, and a gross weight of 1,587 pounds. Powered by a single 80 horsepower Hirth HM60R air-cooled engine mounted beneath the wing at the center of gravity that drove a 4-bladed wooden air-screw using an extended transmission shaft aft of a cruciform tail. Just like the P-59, the cruciform tail had ventral and dorsal fins. The ventral one was to keep the pusher prop from striking the ground on takeoffs and landings. After ground trials, the GO9 was eventually flown early in 1940. With Dornier test pilot Flugkapitän Ivan Quenzler, the GO9 was towed into the air behind a Dornier 17, where it switched to its onboard engines and managed to reach 137 miles an hour in level flight. This flight proved that the pusher air screw and its extension shaft worked without any problems or vibrations. Once more, he approached the RLM, who still believed that a new aircraft of such advanced design was not needed, and that the resources necessary for its development unnecessarily burdened the company's production capacity, and told Dornier to stick to designing and building bombers and flying boats, and the fighters were not the company's concern. One can only imagine the war's outcome if Claude Dornier and Ernst Heinkel had the same support as Willy Messerschmitt. By 1942, the Luftwaffe was beginning to struggle to fulfill its mission with the available aircraft. It seemed as though the days of the Blitzkrieg era of easy victories were over. The development potential of many of the Luftwaffe's aircraft had been exhausted, and the gap in performance and the number of aircraft available gradually widened in favor of the Allies. German fighter pilots were finding their lives increasingly difficult, dealing with the latest Allied aircraft. One in particular was earning their respect, the twin-engined de Havilland Mosquito. The Mosquito was introduced into the RAF in late 1941 and used extensively throughout the war, fulfilling the medium bomber and day and night fighter roles, and being tasked as an anti-submarine machine as well as a tactical striker. See Attack on Amiens Prison. But it was her role as an unarmed reconnaissance machine, which thanks to her incredible speed, made the Mossie a very difficult target for Luftwaffe fighters and caused real mosquito phobia in the RLM. No other Allied machine up to that time, and even later, had such respect as the de Havilland design. The only real competition in the same class as the Luftwaffe for a similar role was the Bf 110, but by 1942 it was so thoroughly outdated that it earned the nickname meat on the table by Allied pilots, although to be fair to the 110, she did see a fair bit of success as a night fighter. It seemed that the decisions, or lack thereof, made earlier in the war were now having increasingly severe consequences, mainly due to the RLM's timid, hesitant, inconsistent response and failure to develop a new generation of frontline aircraft. Mind you, Dornier was not the RLM, and he had not been in the slightest bit put off by their lack of interest. He continued to pursue the design of his own accord. Dornier was so convinced of his ideas that using the P-5904 as a base, he designed a series of tandem-engined machines, starting with the P-231-1 to be powered by a pair of 1,500 horsepower Daimler-Benz DB605E engines. For this design, the engineers attempted to reduce the number of drag-inducing protuberances, going so far as locating the usual air intakes in the wing roots and using a system of ducts to feed air to the engines and oil coolers. The R231-2 followed this initial prototype, fitted with two 1,900 horsepower Daimler-Benz DB603 Type G with a modified wing geometry. The designers also toyed with the idea of a double fuselage aircraft, similar to the Messerschmitt Me-109Z Zwilling, to be named the P-23-1-2-03. Work on the third prototype, P-231-3, continued until May 1943, when it became Projekt P-232-2, which was also a tandem engine design with a significant difference. This machine was to have a so-called mixed drive, a combination of a DB603 engine and a UMO 004C turbojet. Air to the jet engine was supplied by pocket-like intakes on the side of the rear part of the fuselage behind the cockpit. This design was expected to have a top speed of 480 miles an hour with a range of just under 800 miles. But Dornier couldn't wait around. So armed with these plans, he once more traveled to Berlin in January 1943 for a meeting with the RLM. Dornier's words, for reference. I had to translate this from the original German, so please bear with me. We started working on this task at a later time, but were able to draw on earlier work. We assumed that the normal fighter aircraft was outdated in terms of the arrangement of the wing-mounted engines and came up with the tandem arrangement as a solution. An engine with a direct drive, installed normally in a fighter, and an engine behind the pilot, which drives a propeller located behind the tail unit via a shaft extension. The preliminary work was done 5 years ago. We submitted such a project to the office, which was probably premature, but we continued working quietly and built a model aircraft, a smaller version of the Do-17 with a tail propeller, and we carried out tests with this aircraft. The results show there is no influence on the tail unit in any way. Slow to come to the realization, maybe, and now acutely aware of the shortcomings of its machines like the Ju-88 and Bf 110, and heavily influenced by the de Havilland Mosquito, that at the close of 1942, Field Marshal Erhard Milch in the RLM met with Professor Heinrich Hertel from Junkers Works to set specifications and key data for a new fast bomber. Following this meeting, the requirement for a single-seat, unarmed, high-speed intruder/bomber capable of at least 500 miles an hour and delivering a bomb load of at least 1,000 kilograms to the target was drawn up, but it was quickly apparent that these were ambitious specifications, and was subsequently lowered to 460 miles an hour, a bomb load of just 500 kilograms, and a range not less than 2,000 kilometers, were now seen as good enough, and with that, it was sent to the Big Five. Arado, Dornier, Heinkel, Junkers, and Messerschmitt each submitted proposals they hoped would be sufficient to meet the requirements. Arado proposed the ARE-561, a conventional twin-engined aircraft resembling the Bf-110, with potentially 3 crew members and armed with, from what I could find, a pair of MG-81Z guns. The Heinkel design, named the P-1063, about which practically nothing is known, although I did find some notes that had it down as a twin-jet single-seat aircraft. Still, I can't be 100% positive. On the other hand, Junkers put forward 3 interesting designs. The EF-1150, EF-130, and EF-135.0. The EF-115 was a conventional tricycle design with a contra-rotating propeller drive, essentially a new and untested technology. The EF-130 and 135 used a mixed-drive design, each with a conventional piston engine in the front and a UMO 004 turbojet in the rear. But since the Heinkel and the Junkers proposals were based on the highly sought-after UMO 004 jet engine still in development, these tenders would not leave the drawing board. One of the most unusual designs was from Messerschmitt, who understood that the Luftwaffe needed something quickly. They proposed joining 2 Me-109G fuselages at the wings and tail to create the Messerschmitt Bf-109Z1 and Z2. According to Messerschmitt, this configuration was expected to deliver an aircraft which, when fitted with a pair of Jumo 213 engines, could reach 466 miles an hour while carrying a 2,000 kilogram bomb load, and armed with 2 of the devastating Mk108 30mm cannons. Messerschmitt also put forward a third design called the Counter Project, which resembled the Do.335, a very obvious infringement of Dornier's patent rights. The drawing showed 2 engines placed in tandem, which were to be either 2 DB605s or a pair of DB603s, which could theoretically get the Gegenprojekt beyond 500 miles an hour, an incredible speed. Still, alas, we will never know, as it never got beyond the drawing board, probably due to Messerschmitt's insolence in attempting to rip off Dornier's design. Interestingly, Messerschmitt did build the Bf-109Z V1 prototype, but the aircraft was destroyed in the hangar during Allied bombing before it could even take off. With the fore and aft engine arrangement, Dornier's submission was selected as the winning design. Finally, after many delays, false dawns, and with the competition won, Dornier could start the construction of the Do.335 V1 in the spring of 1943 at their works in Mansell. Nonetheless, Dornier was about to discover that Willy Messerschmitt was not his only obstacle. Dr. Passowald, director of the Luftwaffe's development department, had his doubts, so much so that he delayed issuing Dornier the contract. By now tired of having constant obstacles put in his way, Claude Dornier turned to Luftwaffe Inspector General Field Marshal Erhard Milch, an unconditional supporter of the Do.335, although his favorite was the Me-262, who promptly ordered Passowald to stop delaying and hand it over. Finally, the contract was issued for 12 test models, although only 8 prototype airframes were actually built. In June 1943, Mr. H, known for his passion for unconventional weapons, always with the desire to possess the ultimate Wunderwaffe that could turn the tide of the war, intervened into the fast bomber project, advocating for the Me-262 Schwalbe in large numbers and the Do.335 to be given high priority within the framework of the high-speed bomber project. To understand the delays faced by the 335, it is important to understand the situation and the mentality of those in charge at the time, as the fate of the 335 is deeply intertwined with the Me-262. Colonel Nikolaus von Belau described the events that led to the Me-262 being considered for the bomber role. Germany became more and more a helpless target for British air raids. On September 7th, he summoned Professor Messerschmitt and asked him about the state of affairs in development of the jet aircraft. To everyone's surprise, he asked whether this aircraft was also suitable as a bomber, to which Messerschmitt replied in the affirmative. He added that Field Marshal Milch had only caused him difficulties and had not provided him with enough manpower. This was the result of the years-long battle between Milch and Messerschmitt. I was able to explain this and tell him that Messerschmitt always demanded too much without actually having achieved the general standard that would justify the demand. He liked to present individual achievements in such a way that they were seen as ready for series production. I asked him to discuss this question with Milch again. Von Belows also commented on his visit to Insterburg, where the Me-262 was also flown. All those responsible for aircraft production were gathered there. Göring, Milch, Speer, Schauer, Messerschmitt, Galland, Vorwald, etc. In my opinion, the Luftwaffe had once again made the mistake of presenting only almost weapons and equipment that were not yet ready for use. He walked calmly down the long row of aircraft on display. There were, among others, the latest Me-109 and Me-410, the AR-234, the Do.335, and the Me-262. Milch accompanied him and was able to answer his questions about all the equipment. Here, he saw the Me-262 for the first time and was very impressed by its appearance. He called Messerschmitt over and asked him whether the aircraft could be built as a bomber. Messerschmitt answered in the affirmative and said that the machine could carry two 250-kilogram bombs. He replied, "That is the fast bomber," and demanded that the Me-262 be designed as such. Milch tried to blunt his decision by saying, correct, that he only saw a part of the finished machines for bomber production, but failed due to his relentless demands. Göring, who returned to the subject a few days later, was also harshly rebuffed. On the way back to the Wolf's Lair, I had another opportunity to talk with him about the problem and try to save the Me-262 as a fighter plane. He agreed with me in principle and even wanted to have more fighter planes in the Reich, but justified his demand with the political problems at hand. He saw the greatest danger in the near future as being the Allied landing in France. We would have to do everything we could to prevent this landing. In September 1943, 1 month before the first flight of the Do.335 V1, a Führer directive stated the Me-262 was now the only priority, meaning the large-scale production of the 335, which Dornier had hoped for, looked less likely. According to von Belau, in November 1943, the Me-262 made a demonstration flight in Insterburg, only a month after the maiden flight of the Do.335 V1. After seeing the Me-262 fly, he was convinced this was the wonder weapon to stop an Allied invasion of Fortress Europe. By the time the Me-262 went into action, the Luftwaffe lacked the infrastructure, sufficient well-trained pilots, and adequate fuel supplies, and at least halfway intact bases. Without these, it didn't matter how fast or maneuverable the 262 might be. To make matters worse, the 262's turbojet engines were relatively unreliable and would claim many victims before they had even fired a shot. Their response to the thrust settings was slow, making the aircraft unwieldy during takeoff and landing, meaning the jets had to rely on piston-engine fighters for protection due to Allied air superiority. If the 335 had been given priority over the 262, the Luftwaffe might have had a chance had it been produced in large numbers. Ernst Schleifner, an engineer who was working in the Do.335 program at the time, had the following to say: "The Do.335 was not just any plane, it was a special plane, but it had been overtaken by the Me-262 and the AR-234. The Me and Arado, however, were only available in small numbers. The squabble of our leadership over who would get these planes and for what was serious." On the other hand, others would argue that the 335 would have had the same issues as the jet, given the increasingly catastrophic course of the war for Germany, and it would have probably only achieved Pyrrhic victories. Returning to the 335, once the development contract was awarded, The RLM informed Dornier that the original requirement had been overtaken by a demand for a multi-purpose fighter of broadly similar performance. Therefore, Dornier was instructed to investigate the possibility of adapting the Do.335 through multiple versions to fulfill various roles that of a single-seat fighter bomber, a high-speed reconnaissance aircraft, a heavy Gestora, and two-seat night and all-weather interceptor, a demand which would impose considerable delays on the program. On the 26th of October 1943, the day of truth for the Do.335 had arrived. The first Pfeil prototype, registration CP plus UA, rolled out of the factory at Mengen, Baden-Württemberg, powered by a pair of DB603 engines in tandem, each producing 1,750 horsepower. At the time, it was the largest inverted V12 engine produced by the Germans during the war. However, it turned out that the forward engine cowls were too tight, and were replaced with characteristic circular cowls with an annular radiator, which gave the aircraft the appearance of a radial-engined machine. Engine cooling would plague the aircraft for its short life. Its rear engine was prone to overheating, despite having a large scoop intake positioned under the fuselage behind the cockpit. One thing the Pfeil can never be accused of is being a small aircraft. At 5 meters tall and high enough off the ground that a person could walk under the fuselage without bending down, measuring through 13.85 meters in length and with a wingspan of 13.8 meters, she was definitely an imposing machine. At the controls that day was the famous flight captain Hans Dieterle, who in March 1939 had flown the Heinkel HE-100 V8 experimental fighter around a closed course with an average speed of 463.919 miles per hour, which gained the world speed record for Germany, soon after which he left Heinkel to become Dornier's chief test pilot. After the Pfeil's brief maiden flight, which was cut short due to an issue with the main landing gear not locking correctly, Dieterle wrote a positive assessment of the Do.335 V1. "You immediately felt at home on this aircraft. Proof that there was no unpleasant characteristics or peculiarities. As far as can be judged at this point, the special engine arrangement does not have any unpleasant effects. Regarding single-engine flight, it is far superior to the usual engine arrangement. It cannot be determined whether the aft propeller influences the rudders. Takeoff and landing are very easy, partly due to the special undercarriage arrangement. Differences in load are not very pronounced. Controllability is generally acceptable, but a change to the ailerons is necessary to reduce the force. Stability around the lateral axis is too weak, but around the vertical axis is very pronounced." 3 days later, Dieterle repeated the flight tests, even with various teething problems expected with a new aircraft, such as weak landing gear and aft engine cooling. Dornier was sure they had a winning design. The General of Battle Flyers, Major General Peltz, and Colonel Peterson of the Reichland Development Office, who witnessed the first flight, were impressed. Field Marshal Erhard Milch, a firm supporter of the Do.335, became increasingly optimistic as the flight performance data became available. Milch expressed his positive assessment of the Do.335 in a letter to the Reich Chancellery, letting them know that the 335 could carry a 1,000 kilogram payload, twice the bomb load as its rival Me-262, despite being equipped with the latest jet propulsion technology. During the fourth flight, the 335 reached 400 miles an hour at sea level. She was certainly living up to her name, the Arrow. Despite Milch's enthusiasm for the 335, the Führer was still keen on the Me-262 and Arado 234 jets, and decided that the Do.335 be kept in reserve, as the jet technology could still pose many problems. Nevertheless, impressed with the 335, contracts were placed with Dornier for 14 test aircraft, 10 pre-production Do.335A0s, and 11 production Do.335A1 single-seat fighter bombers. In addition, an order for 3 Do.335A10 and A12 two-seat trainers were added to the production schedule. Dornier had hoped the contract would have been much larger, but he expected that bigger orders would be placed once they had ironed out the various issues plaguing the 335, and the RLM would come calling, Reichsmarks in hand. In May 1944, the 335 was taken for more intensive factory testing, during which Dieterle trained the pilots. These factory tests were intended to put the aircraft through a series of demanding trials to reveal any weaknesses or strengths, no matter how minor. Unfortunately, many documents of this period have not survived. either lost to the flames as part of the destruction of knowledge before it fell into enemy hands, or were liberated by the Allies and subsequently lost. Although we know that a lot of work was done to try and fix the aft engine cooling problem, one solution was that to cool the rear engine, the radiator flaps were often opened to the maximum position, and although this reduced the engine temperature, it also reduced the top speed. After preliminary handling trials at Oberpfaffenhofen, the Do.335 V1, identifiable with its forward air intake fitted below the forward engine and painted in RLM 71 dark green, was ferried to their Reutlin Luftwaffe testing facility for official trials. During testing, the V1 completed nearly 30 flights, including high-speed runs, which produced respectable results. As mentioned earlier, at sea level the 335 could hit just over 400 miles an hour, but what was more impressive was that even with the forward engine cut and the propeller feathered, it could still manage a top speed of 348 miles per hour without any of the asymmetrical problems associated with conventional twin-engined aircraft. Interestingly, it flew faster with the aft engine than with the forward tractor power plant. During twin-engine tests, it was found that it could even take off with one engine inoperative, an exceptional feat. The Reutlin pilots were enthusiastic over the characteristics of the Do.335 V1, although they acknowledged some snaking and porpoising at high speeds. But in general, most reports were favorable regarding its general handling behavior, acceleration, turning circle, and maneuverability, which was anything but delicate. Fliegerhauptling Hans van der Leerge summarized his experience. The Do.335 was an unusually powerful aircraft with exceptional flying qualities, and an aeroplane that bestowed on me the pure pleasure of flying, a feeling which I shall not forget as long as I live. At the same time, the Pfeil's full performance had not yet fully been realized. The aircraft's aerodynamics was spoiled by the many dented metal sheets covering the airframe and chipped filler on the wing's leading edges. Unfortunately, before it could be flown at altitude, the V1 prototype was written off when the nose gear failed to extend after a break in a hydraulic line. On November 22, 1943, the pilot made an emergency landing with only its main gear extended, but as the speed reduced, the nose of the 335 settled onto the runway, no doubt causing severe damage to the point that there was no record of the V1 prototype being restored to airworthy condition, and was instead used for ground tests for the DB603E units. A month later, on the 31st of December 1943, the second prototype V2, registration CP+UB, with upgraded DB603A2 engines and a modified forward engine cooler flew for the first time, once again with Hans Dietler at the controls. The following month, Do.335 V3, registration CP+UC, made its first flight on the 20th of January 1944, powered by the new pre-production DB603G0 engines, each producing 1900 horsepower. It was structurally generally the same as the V2. Still, it differed from the previous versions by incorporating the external oil cooler intake in an enlarged annular cowling and a modified fuel system to prevent the same fate as the V2. The criticisms of the poor rear vision were finally solved by adding teardrop-shaped blisters in the cockpit canopy. These housed small rear-view windows and square-glazed panels, which could be opened to improve visibility further. The main wheel well covers were also redesigned, along with wing root fairings and modified exhausts. Although unarmed, the V3 was fitted with dummy 30mm caliber guns. An RB50-30 camera was installed in the bomb bay and handed over to the 1st Squadron of the Experimental Unit of the Luftwaffe's High Command in July 1944. It flew with the registration T9+ZH Tango 9 Zulu Hotel for the Long Distance Reconnaissance Group. This was done to test the sustainability of the Do.335 in the reconnaissance role under operational conditions. According to some records, there were plans to fly Tango 9 Zulu Hotel over Corsica and Sardinia. There were even rumors of several reconnaissance flights over the United Kingdom, flown by test pilot Lieutenant Wolfgang Zieser. But these were only rumors, and in any event, since the aircraft continued to have reliability problems, no one was going to risk losing a valuable aircraft over enemy territory. Very little information regarding the V3 exists, except it was at Reichling until November 1944, having suffered a landing accident which, following repairs, was used to test the Fug 218 Neptune airborne radar system. Up until this point, all tests had progressed without major incidents. However, this changed on April 15, 1944, when Reichling test pilot Werner Outklogger embarked on a sortie from Mengen to evaluate the aircraft's roll characteristics. Shortly after takeoff and at low altitude, the aft engine caught fire. The blaze likely severed the elevator controls, causing the aircraft to plunge vertically into the ground. Witnesses on the ground saw Outklogger jettison the canopy, but inexplicably remained in the cockpit. The aircraft crashed into an anti-aircraft munitions warehouse near Memmingen. Werner Outklogger did not survive. Although the aircraft was totally destroyed, the subsequent investigation showed that despite being only the second ever piston-engine German aircraft fitted with an ejection seat, they could only speculate that Werner had been knocked unconscious by the canopy. The cause of the crash is largely a hypothesis, albeit a very probable one. Despite being fitted with the ejection seat, the pilot had to follow a specific sequence before escaping the cockpit. On the right-hand side of the cockpit were 3 buttons. The first one jettisoned the rear propeller, the second blew off the upper fin and rudder, and the third armed the seat with the compressed air used to propel the pilot clear of the cockpit. Only once the prop and fins had been ejected and the ejection seat armed would the pilot pull 2 large levers to jettison the canopy. After this crash, a series of water tow tests were performed on models to investigate the canopy jettison. The results of these saw a new improved release mechanism fitted to the hood. The loss came when the Allies had stepped up their offensive, and even the most optimistic understood that even the jet-powered Me-262 and AR-234 might not be enough to repel the expected invasion of Europe. In May 1944, the chief of the Jägerstab, Karl Otto Sauer, who coordinated the emergency fighter production program, had to break the news to the Führer that the Me-262 Schwalbe bomber production was not going as well as expected. With this news, he finally decided to prioritize the Do.335 as a fast bomber, issuing an official directive on July 7, 1944, ordering its production to begin as quickly as possible. Even so, by then it was too late to correct the mistakes of the previous year. The Allies had already landed on the beaches of Normandy a month earlier, and were already dominating much of the German airspace. To this end, a false airfield had been laid out in the neighborhood of Mengen, which often fulfilled its purpose when American bombers came in at low altitudes. Due to technical issues, Do.335 V4, despite being the 4th prototype registration, Charlie Papa Uniform Quebec, only took to the air on the 9th of July 1944 with Ivan Quenzler, who had test flown the Göppingen Go-9. Although this was to be a short flight as once more, like the V2 before, it also suffered an aft engine fire, but this time the onboard fire extinguishing system managed to put out the fire. The Do.335 V4 airframe received a new wing that was increased to 18.4 meters, which was designed by the Heinkel Company and intended for the Do.435 program. First proposed in the autumn of 1943, the Do.435 was a night and all-weather interceptor, which based on the P.232-2 was to have a simplified structure, side-by-side seating for its 2 crew members with cabin pressurization, long-span wooden outer wing panels, and most significantly a mixed drive, which was a combination of a DB603 engine and a UMO 004C turbojet. Unsurprisingly, the Do.435 was never destined to be completed, and it was under construction in the autumn of 1944 when the RLM cancelled the program. The initial 4 Pfeil prototypes were unarmed, but this changed with the Do.335 V5, designated CP plus UE, which had a maiden flight on the 2nd of August 1944. The V5 was the first to be fitted with armament consisting of a 30mm engine-mounted Mk108 cannon installed between the cylinder blocks of the forward engine and fired through the axis of the propeller. Plus, the V5 was fitted with 2 20mm MG151-20 autocannons mounted in the forward fuselage's upper decking and carriers for various bomb loads up to a total weight of 500 kilograms. This aircraft was sent to the weapons testing facility at Tarnowitz for firing trials. At Tarnowitz, initial tests were failures. Due to the instability of the aircraft, accuracy issues were exaggerated at higher velocities where the cannons could hit everything except the target. The Oberpfaffenhofen plant kept the Do.335 V6 for various electrical equipment trials such as the Fug 101 radio altimeter. Nevertheless, this aircraft's life was short-lived. Barely a month passed after the maiden flight when an American air raid put an end to her career. The 7th prototype first flew with Hans Dietler once more in the cockpit on the 22nd of May 1944 and was sent directly to Junkers at Dachau, where it was used for ground tests for the UMO 213A and 213E engines throughout the summer. It was hoped these would be potential alternative power plants to the DB603. I did a fair amount of digging around and couldn't find evidence that this variant ever flew with the UMO 213 engines, or even if it was fitted with one or two of the UMO units. Ultimately, the V7 was returned to Dornier in January 1945 and refitted with the original DB603 engines. Unfortunately, this airframe was also destroyed during an Allied air attack. The penultimate prototype, Do.335 V8 registration CP plus UH, flew at the end of May 1944 with Ivan Quenzler. The maiden flight was cut short due to the undercarriage failing to retract, a perennial problem that seemed to plague the 335. The aircraft was sent to Daimler-Benz to install the definitive 2,000 horsepower DB603E1 and LA engines as a testbed for the production aircraft. Here, the aircraft was fitted with flame suppressors necessary for night fighters. The suppressors were tested at Neuburg Air Base from mid-1944 until the final day of February 1945, after which the V8 was returned to Reichlin. From that point, it appears this machine vanished from official records, likely destroyed in Allied bombing, or perhaps seized by the Soviets as they rummaged through the ruins of the Thousand-Year Reich. The final prototype, Do.335 V9 registration CP plus UI, was powered by a liquid-cooled inverted DB603A2, which introduced a new phase of aircraft development as it was completed to pre-production standards, being the first of the A0 series with full armament and at last a strengthened undercarriage. She was first flown on the 29th of June 1944 by Ivan Quenzler and then taken to the Weapons Testing Center at Tarnowitz, where the Mk103 cannons with a supply of 70 rounds and two 15mm MG151 cannons with 200 rounds were extensively tested. Once weapon tests were completed, the 335 was handed over to Leutnant Schild from Jagdgeschwader 26, a frontline squadron who put her through the paces expected of a fighter aircraft. At the end of the tests, he produced a report stating that the 335 would be a very effective weapon in the hands of the veteran pilots. That said, with the current off-the-shelf pilots and their limited and rushed training, the young fighter pilots now being assigned to the units would be overwhelmed by Dornier's unique aircraft and would hardly be able to handle such a demanding aircraft. Unfortunately for the Luftwaffe, the experienced old hands of the glory days who swept all before them were long gone, and those who were left had an almost insurmountable task to clear the skies of the Allied bombers, even if their fuel situation was not so dire. On the 7th of August, the V9 was handed over to the Luftwaffe Research Center in Reichlin for general tests, where one of Germany's most experienced pilots, Heinrich Bove, carried out the tests. Bove was a lucky pilot. He had already test-flown and survived many aircraft, such as the AR-232 transport, the HE-280 and ME-262 jets, the TA-1549 fighter, the FA-223 helicopter, and even the ME-163 Comet rocket fighter, though his luck almost ran out with the 335 after an emergency landing at the end of the summer of 1944. Bove flew the 335 many times, looking for defects and problems or anything else that would cause issues. During these flights, it is claimed that he managed to clock an incredible 490 miles an hour in level flight. Although the maximum speed of 474 miles per hour is often quoted, it is more likely that 434 miles per hour at 16,000 feet was more likely according to the various historical documents and pilot notes. Again, the link to these documents in the description, although they are in the original German. But if the top-end numbers were to be believed, then only the jet-powered ME-262 Schwalbe and the rocket-powered ME-163 Comet were faster, although it is probably safe to say that most would have preferred the 335 over the pilot-dissolving ME-163 any day. For an aircraft of its size, the 335 was unusually agile, which surprised most pilots, helped by having the centerline thrust allowing a faster roll rate. In a simulated dogfight with the FW-190, the heavy twin-engine Pfeil often had the upper hand. In the worst case, the fight ended with the 335 pilot putting his foot on the gas, leaving his opponent in his wake. Other than the jet-powered aircraft, no German and few Allied aircraft could catch or even match the 335 for speed. For the pilot, the 335's office was a roomy, comfortable workplace, unlike the cockpit of the Me-109, which was a tight, claustrophobic fit for the pilots, often filled with mysterious fumes. The view forward, to the sides and down was perfect due to the cockpit's location forward at the wing's leading edge, although the same could not be said about the rear view, where the pilot was limited to the mirrors under the teardrop-shaped blisters on the canopy. Despite the inclusion of the mirrors, it was said that they were practically useless unless the pilots wanted to admire the long fuselage or themselves. Considering the 335's acceleration, it can only be surmised that the designers' confidence in the machine's speed that they expected the pilot to speed their way from danger. However, experiences with Me-262s would prove this presumption incorrect. As slowly and painfully as the Allied war machine was grinding its way towards the borders of the Reich, the Pfeil production was moving even slower, despite the Führer having decreed in July 1944 that the 335 would be given priority. This late decision by the leader significantly accelerated the tests of other prototypes and the start of series production. Given the state of the German war machine and its rapidly depleting resources, one might have expected the focus to be on a single model serving a specific function. Instead, production efforts were directed towards building multiple models designed to cover a dizzying array of operations and tasks. From destroyer, fast bomber, night fighters, 2C training aircraft, and even going as far as having a line for future development, even at this late stage of the war, they were optimistic. The assembly of 10 pre-production Do.335 A0s from serial numbers 240101 to 240110 was delayed after 750 American bombers attacked the Oberpfaffenhofen and Friedrichshafen factories in the early spring of 1944, damaging the assembly halls and workshops. Oberpfaffenhofen managed to escape severe damage thanks to anti-aircraft guns. However, Friedrichshafen was not so lucky in August 1944 when a final raid leveled the plant to the ground. Moving all the production to Oberpfaffenhofen added to the delays. The RAF bombers kept up the pressure almost nightly, which meant that assembling the machines was becoming increasingly difficult, forcing Dornier to decentralize the assembly of the 335 across 13 sites and companies. For instance, wing construction took place in an aircraft hangar in Konstanz, while the fuselages were built in a sawmill in Ummendorf near Biberach in the last weeks of the war. With continual bombing and weakening transport infrastructure, it's a wonder how any 335s were produced. But produced they were, finally. The first Do.335 A0, registered as VGPG with serial number 240101, took to the skies on September 30th, 1944. This was an all-metal monocoque aircraft nearly identical to the V9 prototype. It was powered by a DB603A2 engine in the front and a DB603QA2 engine in the rear, each driving a massive 3-bladed propeller, 3.5 meters in diameter, which reduced the landing run by an impressive 25%. The tractor air screw had a reversible pitch, while the pusher air screw was driven through an extension shaft supported by 3 thrust races. Armament remained consistent with the V9, comprising a single 30mm Mk103 cannon and 2 MG151 cannons, solidifying its formidable offensive potential. Behind the cockpit, separated by an armored bulkhead, was the main fuel tank that could hold 1,230 liters, with 2 additional self-sealing 337-liter tanks in the wing's leading edge on either side of the center section. Variable camber flaps were positioned in the inboard of the hydraulically powered ailerons. If necessary, a drop tank could be carried in the bomb bay instead of 1 500 or 2 250-kilogram bombs. The wings also provided stowage space for the master compass, the armored hydraulic fluid reservoir, and compressed air bottles. The tail assembly was covered by metal stress skin except for the leading edges of the wood fins, which housed radio aerials. A sprung tail bumper was attached to the bottom of the lower fin, which could be jettisoned in the event of a belly landing. For targeting, the pilot had a Revi C12/D reflector sight mounted on a Schwenkplatte, swivel plate SP1, which could function both as a gun sight and as a dive bombing sight. The radio equipment included the FUG 16ZYR/T radio telephone, FUG 25A IFF, identification friend or foe, and FUG 125A blind landing receiver. Of all the 335A0 family, the most well-known is serial number 240102, which has survived to this day. More on this later. Despite 10 pre-production models being built, very few documents survive describing each of these in detail. According to records, the third aircraft registration, VG+PI, with the serial number 240103, was to have a very short and unlucky life, with a series of landing accidents. The 240105 was damaged during a bombing raid. The same fate ended the life of 240106, and 240107 was used for armaments testing to get the data for the 355A1 fighter bomber or Yabo series. The Americans captured the 8th aircraft, serial 240108, at Oberpfaffenhofen in April 1945 while involved with DB603E1 engine trials. The 9th 335 was lost in another accident after a heavy landing on an icy runway, and 240110, the last of the A0 series, was probably destroyed in a bombing raid. After completing the 10 pre-production Do.335A0s, Dornier began work in November 1944 on assembling the first of the many Do.335A1 variants, all of which can be considered the first production aircraft. There is very little original information on many of these various models, and what information does exist is often contradictory. For instance, the number of units produced for each variant is uncertain, but it is most likely that only around 10 aircraft were built across all types, and most of them were incomplete. Nevertheless, what follows is a kaleidoscope of versions and types. It took time, but I was able to compile the following from various published sources. The chaotic production environment in the latter years of World War II further muddled the records. Let me know in the comments if I've made any errors, as most of the sources were translated from original German and Luftwaffe aircraft notes. So, to be clear, the A1 was used as a base platform for multiple types of the 335. The first of the A1 variants started with the Do.335A2, a bomber intended to be powered by two DB603G engines with a higher compression ratio and a takeoff power of 1900 horsepower and 1560 horsepower at an altitude of 24,000 feet. The main armament of 2 MG151s and 1 Mk103 did not differ from earlier series, but the bomb load was increased to 1000 kilograms. It is unlikely any of these types were built. The Do.335A3, classified as a heavy fighter aircraft or Gestora, was equipped with an unusual combination of GM1 and MW50 systems to enhance its performance. The GM1 system injected nitrous oxide into the engine cylinders, boosting performance at high altitudes, where the aircraft's operational reach was typically limited. In contrast, the MW50 system injected a mixture of water and methanol, increasing engine output at lower altitudes. Fitted with DB603G engines, the A3 was designed to operate effectively at high and low altitudes. Like the A2, it is unlikely that any A3 types were actually built. Plans to use the 335 for high-speed, long-range, high-altitude reconnaissance sorties went way back to plans to photograph the British fleet at Scapa Flow in the North Scottish island of Orkney and missions over London. The Do.335A4 was supposed to fill the role of reconnaissance aircraft, with 2 RB50/18 cameras in the weapons bay. This concept was tested on the Do.335V3 prototype. It was believed that when powered with the supercharged DB603G engines, the fire's high speed would provide protection from the enemy, just like the de Havilland Mosquito. On September 4, 1944, an experimental unit designated Erprobungskommando 335 under the command of Hauptmann Alvon Meyer had been set up to introduce the Do.335 to operational service. The purpose of this unit was to develop the 335 as an anti-Mosquito night fighter and evolving fighter-bomber and reconnaissance tactics. On October 26, 1944, German flak units were issued with an aircraft recognition memorandum so that they would not fire on their own side. The following information is given to prevent the new fighter aeroplane Pfeil Do.335 being fired on by our own guns. The aircraft has tandem twin engines with the second propeller behind the tail unit. The latter is in the form of a cross. Despite these preparations, there are just a few isolated accounts of Allied aircraft coming across the Pfeil. One was in 1945, when Tempests of No. 3 Squadron RAF chased a Pfeil over the River Elbe, but it easily outpaced them and made off. The same happened when Mustangs of the 325th Fighter Group, the US 15th Air Force, flying over southern Germany, spotted a Do.335. But just like the encounter with the Tempests, the Pfeil was easily able to outpace them, leaving the P-51s in its wake. In the last 6 months of the war in Europe, the RAF's Bomber Command and the US AAF had stepped up their bombing campaign over Germany, delivering some of the most devastating raids of the conflict, with the RAF alone making up to 10 large raids a month. With Germany's defense crumbling, the Allied bombing strategy shifted towards the total destruction of industrial centers and transportation networks. Cities such as Essen, Dresden, Hamburg, Cologne, and Berlin were not spared, and faced relentless and repeated attacks, with the RAF alone dropping over 150,000 tons of bombs during night raids between January and April 1945. When the war began, Germany didn't have a well-developed means of defense against strategic bombing raids, and at the time, no one thought it possible to develop a bombing offensive to the degree that the Allies would achieve. As the raids started, the Germans' only defense was essentially limited to anti-aircraft artillery and a few ad hoc fighters, if that. The bombing of targets at night often meant that the surrounding area was also razed to the ground. One example of this was the bombing of Cologne on May 30th, 1942. In the course of 90 minutes, the first of the 1,000 bomber raids, or 1,046 aircraft to be precise, dropped 1,455 tons of bombs on the city. But as it was, the Luftwaffe had too few night fighters capable of effectively countering the enemy. By 1944, the Messerschmitt Bf-110G, which had experienced a renaissance as a night fighter, and the Ju-88, was struggling to keep up with the intensity of the bomber assaults, and the Luftwaffe needed more advanced aircraft with greater speed and firepower to challenge the Allied raids. Even new aircraft like the Focke-Wulf TA-154 and the Heinkel HE-219 Uhu, built from the outset as night fighters, were too few to change the Reich's desperate situation. Against this backdrop, in the autumn of 1944, it was stated that the Pfeil could theoretically be an ideal night fighter. Its excellent performance and dimensions meant that it could carry the heavy radar equipment for all weather and night interception missions, and with modifications, an additional crew member. Therefore, Dornier put forward a proposal to adapt the Dornier Do.335 for the night fighting role. This idea led to the 335A6, which shared much of its design with the earlier 335A1, but with a seat for a radar operator, slightly raised behind the pilot's cockpit and covered with a bulged canopy and a specially designed Heinkel ejector seat. The addition of the second cockpit meant that the main fuselage fuel tank had to be reconfigured. The main fuselage fuel tank capacity was reduced to 600 litres. Two 300-litre drop tanks were mounted under the wings to compensate for the lost fuel capacity. To further add to the fuel capacity, the original bomb bay was repurposed to hold 500 litres of fuel, giving the A6 a flight time of 2.65 hours at continuous power at 26,000 feet. The Do.335A6 was to be powered by DB603E 1,750 horsepower engines and be equipped with methanol water injection held in wing tanks, used to boost the engine power at lower altitudes, which briefly increased the power output to 2,000 horsepower. Flame arresters were mounted on the side of the fuselage. These were an absolute must for a night fighter. On the one hand, the light from the exhaust flames would otherwise have a strong blinding effect on the crew, and on the other hand, the bright glow of the exhaust flames would have thwarted any surprise attack. The armament of the Do.335A6 consisted of two MG151s with two 200 rounds mounted under the front cowling and one Mk103 with 70 rounds firing through the front propeller hub, unchanged from previous variants. It was also planned to use the advanced Ruhstahl X-4 air-to-air wire-guided missiles to be suspended under the wing. These missiles had a range of 3 to 5 kilometers. They carried a 20-kilogram high-explosive warhead with a proximity fuse to detonate near the target, increasing the chance of destroying or disabling a bomber. The aircraft was equipped with advanced radar systems for its new role. To detect and engage targets at night or in poor weather, the A6 was fitted with the Siemens Fug 101A radio altimeter alongside the Fug 217 Neptune intercept radar. Also fitted was Telefunken Fug 120 and 350 Naxos Z passive radar, which worked on the emissions of the British H-2S radar set. The radar installation meant a forest of antennae fitted to the wings and fuselage. However, all of these modifications came at a cost. The new kit and extra crewmen pushed the weight of the Pfeil beyond 10 tons, or 10,100 kilograms to be precise. The night fighter could manage only 427 miles an hour, along with a reduction in service ceiling from 36,000 to 33,500 feet. Do.335, registration CP plus UK, the first night fighter prototype that, although completed in November 1944, was not flown until January 24, 1945, minus all the radar equipment and associated MacGuffins. Shortly after the flight, the A6 was handed over to the Luftwaffe research and testing facility in Verneichen to complete the trials, but due to the advance of the Soviet troops, it was later evacuated to Stade, where the Fug 218 radar was to be installed. The aircraft was eventually handed over to the operational unit Nachtjagdgeschwader 3. Many versions of the night fighter were proposed, each with varying modifications and updated systems, such as de-icing, gyroscopic gun sights, and high-speed reversible pitch propellers. At a conference of the Special Commission for the Development of Night and Bad Weather Fighters in Berlin on January 24, 1945, headed by Professor Kurt Tank of Focke-Wulf, had his concerns regarding the longevity of piston-engine designs. He is on record saying, "It will only be adequate until around mid-1945. After that, only the Me-262 and AR-234 jets will be suitable until the development of a new three-seater." Despite these reservations, the Commission evaluated the Do.335 night fighter along a mixed power derivative, combining piston and jet propulsion. Dornier promised to deliver the first batch of 50 Do.335 A6s by March 1945, with production to be transferred to the Heinkel factory in Vienna. However, Heinkel was overloaded with HE-162 production and could not fulfill the order. Still, despite the high priority associated to the 335 program, circumstances prevented the necessary jigs and tools from being assembled, but it was rumored that at least one aircraft may have been assembled at Heinkel. Germany's most successful night fighter pilot, Heinz Wolfgang Stauffer, known as the Night Ghost of St. Trond, credited with 121 aerial victories, recommended adding cannons in the upward slanting Schrage Musik configuration to the Pfeil's armament. Had the Do.335 night fighter been produced earlier, in larger numbers and equipped with Schrage Musik, jazz music cannons, it's likely Bomber Command would have faced far greater losses. For instance, during the 4 raids on Dresden between February 13th and 15th, 1945, when the RAF and US AAF dropped over 3,900 tons of bombs on the city, the presence of the Do.335 might have significantly disrupted Allied bombers. I think the Do.335 could have altered the outcome of specific raids, but it's unlikely it would have changed the overall course of the war. The same would also apply to whether or not the Allies decided to bomb Dresden, which caused a devastating firestorm and the loss of tens of thousands of lives. In the absence of either, the broader strategic situation would have remained largely unaffected. By the war's end, the first night fighter prototype fell into French hands. As the war continued to go south for Germany over the course of 1944, the 335 program was shifted towards producing the B series. These would have improved armor and a strengthened structure that could take a real beating and a more aggressive armament configuration, bristling with cannons to better deal with the Allied bombers such as the RAF Lancaster and the American B-17 Flying Fortress. The first of the many B versions was the B-1 single-seat fighter, and although two of these models were planned, neither was finished by the end of the war, most likely stopped in favor of the more heavily armed Do.335 B2 and B3 models, classified as Zerstörer, or heavy fighter aircraft for destroying bombers. The second of the Do.335 B2 prototypes, registration RP plus UQ, was fitted with a DB603E1 engine in the front and a DB603QE in the rear. The 335B2 was first flown on October 31st, 1944. Armament-wise, she would be, in every sense, a destroyer. Two 30mm Mk103 cannons were mounted just inboard of the main undercarriage attachment points, each with a supply of 70 rounds, and the 30mm cannon firing through the propeller hub. But to be sure, these three 30mm cannons were to be augmented by two faster-firing 20mm MG151 cannons fitted above the cowl. There were even plans to swap out the 30mm engine-mounted cannon which fired through the propeller hub with the newer 55mm Mk112 as soon as it became available. Only 10 prototypes of the 55mm cannon were produced, but none were installed on the Pfeil. These heavily armed aircraft would have been formidable opponents to the Lancasters, Liberators, and Flying Fortresses. A few accurate hits from the arsenal of cannons, particularly the 55mm cannon firing at 300 rounds per minute, would have devastated any heavy bomber. At the war's end, RP plus UQ fell into the hands of the Free French at Mengen Airfield. The B3 was to be equipped with the more powerful DB603LA engines, each fitted with two-stage superchargers and MW50 injection. Both the L and LA engines were designed to fly at high altitudes, even though the takeoff power of the L version was rated at a very respectable 1820 horsepower. The LA version had a takeoff power of up to 2000 horsepower. The increase in performance compared to the previously used DB603A and E versions was, therefore, considerable. The only problem was that the engines were unavailable, and the work to complete them constantly dragged on, with Daimler-Benz setting a delivery date of June 1944. By the time the Americans arrived at the Oberpfaffenhofen factory, these were found in advanced assembly stage, although none had been completely finished. The 335B4 was supposed to be an unarmed high-altitude reconnaissance aircraft expected to be delivered in March 1945, with cameras stored in the bomb bay and powered by a pair of 2000 horsepower DB603LA engines. This model was essentially the Do.335A4, except for the features characteristic of the B version, such as larger wheels, armored cabins, etc. The fundamental difference was the new wing with a span of 18.4 meters and an area of 43 meters squared, designed by the Heinkel Company. Unfortunately for the B4, Germany needed fighters and bomber destroyers for this version, so the Do.335B4 reconnaissance program had little hope. There is not much info on the B5 weapons trainer, other than it was supposed to be a copy of the A4 and powered by two DB603E1s. And like the B4, it too never left the drawing board. The B6 was to be a night fighter similar to the A6 night fighter, other than having either the DB603LA or E1 engines, depending on the source, improved armor, structurally strengthened, and of course those additional cannons. 50 of these were supposed to have been built by Heinkel at their Oranienburg factory, with a delivery date of April 1945. Like the A6, they would initially be fitted with the Fouk 220 radar, to be later replaced with the Fouk 218 G/R Neptune. This radar had the ability to find and warn the B6 crew of approaching enemy night fighters, such as the Mosquito, Beaufighter, or that American monster, the Black Widow. Like the B4, no examples of the B6 or the more advanced B7 night fighters were completed. The final B-series planned was the high-altitude B-8 night fighter with a wingspan of 18.4 meters and an area of 43 square meters to begin production in September 1945. Needless to say, no B-8 was ever completed, the same as the B-12. the final version of the B series, which was to be a 2-seat trainer equipped with the exact specifications of the A12 trainer. Had these B models gone into meaningful production, they would have been a real threat to the RAF Terrorflieger, and even the fast and dangerous Mosquitoes would no longer have had the night skies to themselves and could have potentially shifted the balance of power, at least in the air defense role. Even though in 1945 the writing was on the wall for the Third Reich, Dornier did not stop developing new designs. But this time, the first of the new propulsion units started to appear, namely the Junkers Jumo 222 inline liquid-cooled 2,000 horsepower 24-cylinder engine with planned upgrades to 2,500 to 3,000 horsepower. That was planned for another version of the 335. There were other designs in the works, such as the DO P256 3-seat jet-powered night fighter, but perhaps the most interesting development of the basic airframe was the DO 335Z, or JU-635 as it was later designated. This was to be a long-range reconnaissance aircraft which comprised two standard DO 335 fuselages coupled together by a new center section. The JU-635 would have had a range of over 8,000 kilometers and able to fly across the Atlantic, working closely to protect their U-boats. But, as we know, there was a shortage of resources, materials, and workers, a large proportion of whom were unqualified and replaced by forced laborers and concentration camp prisoners, who could hardly be described as actual replacements. Interestingly, despite the crushing burden of the Allied bombing offensive, Albert Speer was forced to restructure how aircraft were produced by shifting production to mines and bunkers. In 1944, no fewer than 40,500 aircraft of various types were produced, and from January 1945 to the end of the war, 7,500 aircraft left the final assembly line. We can only imagine the losses to the Allies if even a few hundred 335s had been built. Still, these would have been delaying the inevitable, given the increasingly dire situation in Germany, the growing pressure from Allied forces on all fronts, and the deteriorating state of the Luftwaffe. Even if these aircraft had entered production, their impact would have been very limited. Although the 335 was not the definitive fastest propeller-driven aircraft by the war's end, it was a contender for the top 5 at the very least, if the much-quoted 474 mph figure is used. Here, the 335 shares the podium with the likes of the Supermarine Spiteful F Mark 14 and Mark 16, the P-51H Mustang, and the Republic P-47M. Before you all hit the comments asking why I am not including various other machines, it's simply because there are so many low production and experimental aircraft to choose from. Plus, prototypes are almost always lighter and cosseted, making the top speed unrealistic in service, and if we go down that road we could be here all day. In any event, a fighter's top speed is only part of the story, which depends on various factors such as altitude, fuel mixtures, weight, temperature, atmospheric pressure, and the list goes on. Adding to the complexity, there was no universal standard for measuring or calculating speeds at the time, and manufacturers often tested their aircraft differently, further complicating direct comparisons. Combat performance was also influenced by other variables such as the skill of the pilot, climb rate, and turning radius. Fighters of that era were not built for racing, and aerial combat rarely occurred at an aircraft's maximum speed. In fact, a lot of dogfights were often fought close to stall speed, as pilots tried to outmaneuver each other rather than chasing outright top-end speeds. However, top speed did determine whether a fighter could catch an adversary to engage them or successfully break off combat to escape and survive. In such scenarios, the faster aircraft held a clear advantage, dictating when and how the engagement would occur and when it would end. As a bomber-destroyer, there is no doubt the B-series would have been a very real thorn in the side of the Allied bombers had they been mass-produced and gone into service. Although Germany had been fighting a losing war even before the 335 took to the skies on the 26th of October 1943. In 1945, when the US forces captured the Dornier factory at Oberpfaffenhofen, they found several complete 335 aircraft, with many of these strange birds in various stages of construction,
and some damaged by Allied bombing. There is an anecdote that a GI asked why the aircraft had a propeller in the rear, whereby a German was said to have replied, "So that you can fly backwards too." With German mechanics' help, American aircraft engineers started to work on the airworthiest machines, soon learning that American aviation fuel and the DB603 were not a great match. 2 airframes, A1 and A2, were seized as part of Operation Seahorse, which involved taking German aircraft for intensive tests. Both aircraft flew the Cherbourg, with the Do.335A1 being flown by German test pilot Hauptmann Hans Padel and the Do.335A2 by an American pilot. After arriving and boarding the ship HMS Reaper, the Pfeils were given registration numbers 8 and 35. On July 20th, along with 38 other aircraft, including numerous Me-163s and HE-162s, Volksjäger planes, various pieces of German loot, and many aircraft of Italian origin were also transported, heading to the United States. Frequent issues with the rear engine overheating prevented intensive testing, and any results from these tests are difficult to find. So we will never know if the famously quoted speed of 474 miles per hour is true. Plus, in the era of the first jet fighters, the Navy lost interest in the aircraft, at which point the 335 was sent to NAS Norfolk in 1947, and then in 1961 to the Smithsonian Institution. 13 years later, in May 1974, they received a letter from the Deutsche Museum in Munich, which wanted to borrow one of the 2 airplanes to promote a newly opened exhibition. In 1975, it was shipped back to Germany inside a Lufthansa 747, where it was carefully restored by the Dornier Company and was displayed at the Deutsche Museum until 1986, when it was returned to the United States. It is now on display at the Stephen F. Udvar-Hazy Center of the National Air and Space Museum. 2 captured aircraft were transferred to the British under Lieutenant Commander Eric M. Brown of the Royal Aircraft Establishment. The first of these, a Do.335A10 2-seat trainer, reached the RAF Farnborough on September 8, 1945. After being overhauled, the machine was test flown by Wing Commander Rowley Falk, famous for his work with the Avro Vulcan, on October 1st. Lieutenant Commander Brown found the Do.335 a most impressive aircraft, possessing the rare quality of being overpowered. It also had excellent visibility from the roomy cockpit, a feature which Brown thought would make it an ideal night fighter. Sadly, the aircraft was destroyed on January 16, 1946, when the rear engine caught fire and burned through the elevator controls. This caused the airplane to dive vertically into a schoolhouse at Cove in Hampshire. The pilot, Group Captain Alan F. Hards, commander of the RAE, was killed instantly. The other British Do.335 was an A0 subtype found at Reims in France. The airplane came to grief on its 3rd flight on December 13, 1945, when the pilot, Hauptmann Miersch, was unable to lower the nose wheel. The aircraft made an emergency landing, but was never flown again. At least 2 Do.335s were captured by French forces. The French found 3 Pfeils at Mengen. One was practically useless, but of the 2 remaining machines, one was the V-10 2-seat night fighter in a very advanced stage of assembly, and the third was an airworthy V-13 destroyer. The airworthy Dornier Do.335 was sent to the Flight Test Center for evaluation, but engine problems again emerged. The aircraft began to vibrate violently when on landing approach, with smoke filling the cockpit. Believing the issue stemmed from overheating of the aft engine, the pilot promptly shut it down. However, the vibrations and smoke persisted, prompting him to shut down the forward engine. It was later discovered that the cause of the failure was a connecting rod failure in the forward engine. The powerless Do.335 landed hard on the runway, bursting a main wheel on impact. To make matters worse, the brakes failed, leaving the pilot unable to control the aircraft as it careened down the runway and collided with the parked B-26 bomber. The second Do.335, the 2-seat night fighter, was completed with the assistance of German engineers. However, it suffered a rear engine compressor drive failure before being flown. After repairs were made, the aircraft finally took to the skies on May 29, 1947, completing a 30-minute flight, during which it reached a top speed of 434 miles per hour at 15,000 feet. Unfortunately, the second French Pfeil shared a fate similar to its predecessors. Written off after a main gear hydraulic failure during taxiing caused it to collapse onto the ground. Regrettably, very little data from these French test flights was preserved. Ultimately, the Do.335 was a unique idea, and no matter how advanced the B-series was, it would have arrived too late to alter the war's course.